Okay, folks. Hope everybody's doing well. We are going to finish off the respiration unit by finishing off the third respiration video on gas exchange. This is where we left off in video number 3. We had talked about gas exchange. There was lots going on. We had talked about ways that oxygen is transported in our blood, gets dissolved in plasma, and it attaches to hemoglobin. We talked about ways that CO2 is transported in the blood. It's dissolved in plasma. It's attached to hemoglobin as well, carbaminohemoglobin. And the majority of it gets converted by an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase into something called the bicarbonate ion. And it travels in our blood that way. Remember that equation also produces some H+, which could cause our blood to become acidic, which is not good. So that H+ also binds to hemoglobin to make reduced hemoglobin. We will see that equation again in just a moment. I've got kind of 2 more ideas for us to look at here to finish off. This video will be much shorter than the last one, so don't worry. What I want to talk about is that ability of our body to take away the H+. So I mentioned in the previous video how important it is for us to maintain blood pH. So it needs to be right around 7.4. I think it's actually a little bit closer to 7.35. And the pH, the acidity or the basicity of your blood needs to be right there. You run into some issues as soon as you fade by even like 0.1. You would start to feel that, and you'd feel the effects of that. So in order to keep our blood at a constant 7.4, it's really, really, really important for us to deal with that H+ in this equation. So this ion right here, we have to deal with that. That's really important. It can make things too acidic or too basic if we take too much of it away. So let me run you through a couple of different scenarios here, and I bet you've experienced one of them anyways. I want you to think about hyperventilation. So hyperventilation means you're breathing really, really quickly. So this would be, I do this all the time in the summer, quick breathing. This is when my kids give me something like a floaty, like this little tiger one, and they say, "Dad, blow up this floaty so we can go to the beach." And I sit there and I want to fill it up really quickly. Maybe I don't have access to my air compressor if we're at the beach already. And I start just going with lung power, and I start just breathing, right? Trying to fill this thing up as quickly as I can. In hyperventilation, I want to go down to that equation so we can talk about what's going on. When you start breathing quickly, what you're doing is you're exhaling a lot. And when you're exhaling a lot, that is causing the amount of CO2 to decrease. So the amount of CO2 goes down because you're exhaling all of that CO2. It's like you're digging a little CO2 hole, right? So that CO2, you're digging a hole, you're digging a hole, you're digging a hole because you're exhaling it all, you're getting rid of it. And what that's going to do, if you dig a hole on the CO2 side of this equation, is you're going to have kind of a landslide where this equation wants to fill the hole in. Because your body wants homeostasis, right? It wants to keep everything the same. So what ends up happening is the equation shifts really aggressively to the left. It shifts that way to help fill in that missing CO2 because you're exhaling it really, really fast. So this equation, we get like big arrows pushing to the left-hand side. And if we start taking all the bicarbonate out of our blood and all the H+ out of our blood and converting it into CO2, because we're trying to fill in that hole that you've dug by exhaling really fast, what that means is the amount of H+ it actually goes down. Because it's trying to fill in, it's getting used up to fill in that CO2 hole that we've created. And when your H+ goes down, this is like a little chemistry lesson, that actually means the pH goes up. So going down, this H plus means the pH goes up. And that's not good. You might get up to like a 7.45 or something. You're starting to get into the danger zone there. So that is called alkalosis. When the pH goes up, increased blood pH, that's called alkaline, when things become more basic. So this is a biological instance called alkalosis. I would imagine that you have experienced this if you try to blow up or inflate something too quickly. And the number one thing that you will notice, and I notice this every single time, is this part, the dizziness. I get really lightheaded, and I actually have to stop and take a break. I have to stop exhaling all the CO2, let my body fill in that CO2 hole, and then sort of balance things out again. I've never gotten to the twitching stage. That'd be interesting to be on the beach and I'm inflating a floaty for my kids and all of a sudden I'm convulsing in the sand. But I have certainly felt quite lightheaded and needed to stop because I felt like I was going to pass out. And that's because this equation is shifting to the left, because it's trying to fill in this hole right here. We've got a big CO2 hole that the equation tries to fill in by binding all the bicarbonate and the H plus and pushing that equation left. So there's one interesting instance of sort of H plus going a bit wonky in terms of its levels. We actually become basic, right? Alkaline. So when you hyperventilate, you're in danger of alkalosis. You start to feel a bit dizzy. Now, what if we do the opposite of hyperventilation? And you're like, well, what would that be? Well, instead of breathing really quickly, what if we don't breathe enough? So, same thing. We're talking about how H plus can impact our body. What about hypoventilation? So, hypo is reduced breathing. It's like holding your breath. So I want you to think about, let's go straight down to the equation here. Let's think about what would happen during hypoventilation. So you're not breathing very much. If you're not breathing often, that means instead of CO2 levels going down, instead of you digging a hole, all of a sudden CO2 starts to build up. CO2 levels increase because you're not getting rid of that byproduct of cellular respiration. So you build not, I guess, a CO2 hole, but there's like a CO2 hill, right? You start to build this up. And just like if you try to pile sand, if you're building a sandcastle, we'll go back to the beach. If you're building a big pile of sand, eventually the sand will sort of just slough down, right? It starts to flow downwards. Just like here, if you start to build up CO2, and it piles up, it's going to push this equation potentially quite aggressively to the right-hand side. You've got this buildup of CO2 and your body's trying to deal with that, so it starts pushing this equation to the right. So it takes CO2 and it starts binding it with water, and it makes lots of bicarbonate, and it makes lots of H+. And the making lots of bicarbonate's fine. That's not going to do anything to your pH levels. But all of a sudden, you start making too much H+. So your carbonic anhydrase on your red blood cells, on your hemoglobin, starts working like crazy, and you start making lots of H+. So you make lots of that. And again, chemists in the room, you know that if you're making lots of H+, you are bringing the pH down. Things are becoming acidic. So the pH drops. You become acidic. Your blood does anyways. The pH might go down from 7.35 to 7.3. Doesn't seem like a huge change, but it's enough to cause some issues. That is called acidosis. So when you decrease the blood pH, so when that goes down, you are becoming acidic. And that throws people off sometimes. You got to be a bit careful because sometimes people get mixed up with which way the pH is going. When it goes down, you're more acidic. So decreased blood pH due to an increase in these H+ ions is acidosis. Now, if you don't breathe for too long, and I don't want you to try this, you can very quickly, in the span of a few minutes, run yourself into some huge trouble, possibly coma and death. Obviously, right, if you don't breathe. But it's actually not because you're running out of oxygen. It's because your blood becomes too acidic. That's the big issue with sort of like drowning or holding your breath for too long. And I will say that if we were together in a classroom, and I wish we were, I miss you guys, we would do a little fun competition for people that wanted to, where we just see how long we can hold our breath. Not even a competition, but just a little challenge for you to see how long you can hold your breath. And the last time I did this, last year, I held my breath. I did really well. I was almost 3 minutes, which actually surprised me just on my first try. But it made me feel really crappy for like 15 minutes. It started to like hurt, and I was fighting that urge to breathe. And about the 3-minute mark, when I actually did breathe again, that sort of pain of or urge of wanting to breathe in my lungs went away, but my head didn't feel right. And like I say, it was like a solid 10-15 minutes before I felt normal again. And that was because I was slowly making my blood more acidic. And I think this one, you can get rid of the dizziness in alkalosis pretty quickly. Like you just stop inflating your floaty, and I find usually within 5 or 10 seconds I feel good. But this one took me longer. Significantly longer. So this one's a bit harder for your body to sort of balance out again once you become more acidic. So that's what happens when you hold your breath for a long time. Reduced breathing, hypoventilation. You run into this instance of acidosis. And this is a picture of David Blaine. There's a TED video and a fill-in sheet on the website that you should try, where he trained himself to hold his breath for more than 17 minutes, which is absolutely redonkulous. And it talks about some of the training he did. He's very candid about it. It's worth your time to watch it. It's really quite interesting. Not that I want you to try that. You're not going to go hold your breath until you pass out or something. But it is weird, those internal physiological changes that are happening when you do try to hold your breath. So acidosis, alkalosis, that whole equation shifting depending on whether you're breathing too fast or too little. And then there's one last thing I want to show you that's kind of cool. And that is that the pressure of oxygen, or the amount of oxygen, and the temperature, and the pH is different at your lungs than it is at your cells. You can probably appreciate that, right? We know that there's more oxygen at your lungs than the cells. It turns out the pH is higher at your lungs. It's more acidic at your cells. Think about lactic acid, right, at your muscle cells when you're working out. And the temperature is lower at your lungs than it is way inside your body, like in your muscles. And all three of those things, these different PO2s and different temperatures and different pHs, actually help hemoglobin to bind oxygen when we want it to. And it helps hemoglobin sort of kick off the oxygen when we want it to. So I want you to think about this at your lungs. You know you've got lots of O2 because you're inhaling that higher concentration oxygen out of the air. Thank you, plants, for photosynthesizing and giving us oxygen. So at your lungs, the oxygen levels are high. The temperature is low. The temperature inside your body is almost 40 degrees. That's going to be warmer than it is for most times with the air that you breathe. So the temperature is lower and the pH is higher. It's around neutral, maybe even slightly basic. And those three conditions, a high temperature, a low pH, high oxygen, low temperature, and high pH. There we go, got it that time. Helps hemoglobin to bind oxygen. So it favors the uptake and we get these levels, we saw these in the pictures in the last video, somewhere in the neighborhood of 90 to 100% saturation. So it helps the hemoglobin to go from that tense state and open up like a flower into the relaxed state, which opens up those seats for oxygen to bind. So those conditions are perfect to help oxygen bind onto hemoglobin, which is exactly what we want at the lungs. We want to saturate, we want to fill up all those seats with oxygen so that we can move them in the bloodstream and then kick them off at the cells. So at the lungs, we have these three conditions. This is probably just evolution, right? That it favors the oxygen getting onto the hemoglobin because that's what we want. And then we actually want the reverse at our cells because we want to deliver the oxygen to the cells so they can use it for cellular respiration. So at your cells, all of those three conditions, they reverse. The concentration of oxygen is lower. So oxygen will want to diffuse just by concentration gradients, high to low. The temperature is higher, especially if you're working hard, your muscles will get really warm. Next time you lift weights or go for a run or something, you can feel your muscles after, and they're actually quite warm. So the temperature is high and the pH is low. Again, it drops into the acidic level. Think about like lactic acid, that burning of your muscles. Those three conditions actually help oxygen get booted off of the hemoglobin, which is exactly what your body wants. It wants all that oxygen getting off the ride and going into the cells. So you can see here that the saturation levels go way down. It goes down to like 60 or 70%. It won't necessarily kick all the oxygen off. It's kind of weird that way. It's not 100% efficient, but we go from like 100 to 60. That's pretty good. We've delivered a lot of oxygen that way. So I always think that's pretty darn cool, that the conditions in your lungs are exactly what exactly what hemoglobin needs to become oxyhemoglobin, to bind some oxygen. And then at your cells, the internal conditions are exactly what we need to boot that oxygen off so that our cells can actually use the oxygen. So that's the last little bit here, looking at the O2 temp and pH levels and how that impacts hemoglobin. Whew, you made it. That's a busy one. So again, the last two lessons, they are the last two videos, 3 and 4 on gas exchange. Busy, busy, busy. I want you to try that gas exchange summary that's posted on the website. I think I've actually got it here. This is all very slow. Yeah, so try this document out. I will make an answer key and post it online. Heck, it might even be there by the time you watch this video. But go through this gas exchange summary. Do your best to fill in the blanks and answer the questions that are in there. And please, please, please bring questions to the next Zoom meeting or fire me an email. You're very likely going to need some clarification on some of this stuff or want to go over it with me. So let's chat in a Zoom meeting. Let's meet up and make it like regular school, where you ask lots of great questions and I hopefully provide lots of great answers. So I hope to chat with you guys very soon. Also look for Respiration quiz number 3. That'll go online at some point the week of the 27th, if I have my dates right. So check Microsoft Teams. There'll be 3 quizzes this unit. You'll want to try all 3 of those. Again, questions, email me, or even better, join us for a Zoom meeting. See you soon, folks.